Hello and welcome to UnHerd. I'm Freddie Sayers. Something is happening in Europe. We've been used for so many decades to Germany being this peace-loving economic powerhouse at the heart of Europe. Somehow the European Union has depended on it. You might even say the whole globalization era depended on it. It was this post-politics, post-history, Angela Merkel technocratic atmosphere that emanated from Germany. Suddenly that no longer seems so certain. The alternative for Deutschland, the AfD party, is rising. The latest polls, they score over 20%. Politics is fractious. It feels like economics and politics are really changing, and that is going to affect all of us, both in Europe and perhaps the wider West. Wolfgang Munchau is, by our account, perhaps the best observer of European politics writing in the English language. For his sins, he used to write a column for the Financial Times, but throughout that period he was a brave and independent-minded voice who managed to avoid the herd mentality. Now he's branched out, he runs something called Eurointelligence, and he's here in the studio to help us understand what is really happening in Germany. Welcome, Wolfgang.
Well, Freddie, thank you for inviting me.
The alternative for Deutschland, AfD. There's a lot written about it. I saw a piece this morning that describes them as fascists. There's a lot of paranoia, a lot of fear that somehow Germany is reverting to its far-right past, etc. What's your kind of overall take on what's happening there?
If you look at the European far-right parties, the AfD is quite special. Most of the far-right parties are led by strong leaders. Le Pen, Meloni, they are basically shaped, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, they're shaped in the image of their leaders. That's not the case of the AfD. So if you wanted to draw sort of historic parallels with the Nazis in particular, they are very different in that respect. There isn't a leader. I often forget the name of their leaders. They have two joint party chiefs, and they keep changing. And there are lots of internal rebellions against them. This is a party that's very insurrectional against its own leaders in the past. But they are on the far right. They are not a...
What do you mean by far right? I've got to call you up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. No,
I'm always hesitant to use that term because what's the difference between far right and just right?
They have goals that I would consider, incompatible with constitutional law, for example. One of the goals they recently pronounced was not only Germany's exit from the EU, which is, legal. Obviously, there's a legal procedure for that. But they wanted to the disbandment of the EU, which is obviously not something that a country can do because you ultimately... the only way to do this is through tanks, basically. Some members of the party have been outwardly anti-Semitic. That has been something that has happened. I wouldn't call the party officially anti-Semitic. It's not like this is an anti-Semitic platform. But it's a party that it also has neo-Nazis in them.
In a way, that's true even of Nigel Farage's parties in the past. It's a common thing with right-wing parties. You always get the more, let's say, colourful characters tend to sort of aggregate there. Is it fair to judge a whole party or a whole movement, or in the case of the AfD, 20% of the German population who say they might support them, by just those few characters there?
No. I think you can't. It's not helpful to characterize any party with sort of with a word or with an adjective. They are on the far right. That is clear. They're not a conservative party. They are on the far right. Would I call them fascist? No, I don't call Meloni a fascist either because it doesn't help me. It doesn't help me understand what's going on. She obviously has roots in the far right, in the fascist movement in Italy. That was a fact. But she has moved away, and what we see, she moves from the center right. She governs from the center right. The AfD is different in the respect that that its policies are very different, for example, from Meloni. If you take Meloni as sort of the other far right party, the one that actually succeeded to get into government, they want Germany to leave NATO. They want Germany to leave the EU naturally and the euro, of course.
So the original energy for the AfD comes out of the immigration issue. That was after this big 1 million plus refugees arrived after Syria in 2015, and Angela Merkel did her whole "Wir schaffen das," we can cope with this, we can welcome all these people. That was very controversial. Where is the immigration issue now?
So as you rightly said, 2015 was the moment when it also was the moment its support grew. By the 2021 election, it had already ebbed away. The party has been mostly in the news in that period after it sort of had its initial boost of support. It was mostly occupied with internal strifes and power struggles among party members. It only ended up at 10% at the 21 election, which is only 2 years ago. What happened between 21 and today, in this 2 years, is that the party doubled its vote overall. Not much in West Germany, but dramatically in East Germany. I mean, to go from 10% to 20% in all of Germany means it has to do extremely well in East Germany. And in some parts of East Germany, the party is now the largest party. It has now won its first mayoral election. It has won its first regional election, so there's a regional president now from the AfD. So it starts to win election. Previously it was like, a system of proportional representation. When you are 20% and nobody wants to do form coalitions with you, you have a lot of MPs or councillors sitting around, but you're never in power. That is now starting to change. They now have their first, people in office, basically.
The East German thing is worth understanding because that's obviously a poorer part of the country. In some ways, you've written that it's parallel to flyover country or the industrial heartlands that have been suffering over recent decades in places like the US and in Britain and in other countries. So actually, that suggests that economics is a big part of the appeal.
This is the reason why the AfD is now gaining support. It is a very clear. I mean, we've looked at. There's Germany's economic performance, which is weak at the moment, which for reasons that have to do with Germany's economic model. I mean, you have in your introduction described Germany as an economic powerhouse. The general storyline is Germany did really well until recently. Now it's doing really badly. What's happened? But what happened in Germany, in the German economy, the difficulties that we're seeing today, the roots of that date back a long time ago. Germany made itself dependent on Russian gas. As a result, it also made itself dependent on industry because that was a stronger sector. It had huge export surpluses. Germany had a current account surplus for many years for 8% of GDP, which for a large industrial country is just mind-bogglingly large.
That was made possible, is it fair to say, by the European Union, by the structures that put in place?
That's right. We have an internal market. Also, the currency helped Germany because what Germany always does when it is in a monetary union with others, it tries to obtain a competitive advantage by reducing wages so that your costs relative to others are lower and they can't adjust because the exchange rate is fixed. So for Germany, the fixed exchange rates have always worked like a charm. A huge factor was that this was sort of the heyday of it's called the analog age, the heyday of the fuel-driven car, of the diesel car, the heyday of oil heaters and all the things that Germany did. And it was the time of massive globalization, and what countries like China and other developing countries, they needed equipment and machinery, machine tools to actually, and they bought them from Germany. Now that they're in a much more mature phase of their economic development, they need less, and China is now, for the first time, it flipped the trade balance in its favor.
You mentioned energy. Obviously, Germany's been used to Russian gas. Meanwhile, it's been winding down its nuclear power capabilities. It's completely gone, and now finds itself pretty vulnerable and precarious because it's also shut off Russian gas and the pipeline isn't working anymore. How much is that driving the AfD and driving the political instability?
That's certainly one factor. Energy policy is one factor. The Greens insisted on a phase out of nuclear power, and the other parties accepted that this is not a fight they wanted to fight, because in Germany you tend to lose these kind of fights. So both Merkel and the SPD, they all favored the phase out of nuclear power, and it happened this year. It's gone. The last power station was switched off in April.
I mean, it's so wild for ordinary common sense.
It makes no sense. It makes only sense if you understand the history of the debate about nuclear power. If you understand the Green Party was born as an anti-nuclear protest. I do remember growing up in Germany in the 70s. That's where we saw the first protests about, there was a protest movement that later morphed into the Green Party. And it's a quasi-religious issue for them. It was not, there was Greta Thunberg criticizing the Greens for prioritizing the phase out of nuclear over the CO2 emissions, because what now happens, now that gas is gone or the Russian gas is gone and the nuclear power is switched off, Germany is now has increased the share of electricity coming from coal. and especially from brown coal, which is an incredibly dirty version of this lignite. And the CO2 emissions are going up again.
So by that account, voters can legitimately be angry with the people that made those decisions, because it feels on the energy point like a self-inflicted, like an own goal, because the nuclear power would be handy.
There was another thing that happened earlier this year when the government introduced the domestic heating bill. Now, you're going to have the same coming in the UK as well, is the switch over from traditional gas heating and oil heating systems to heat pumps. And heat pumps work very differently from gas heaters. They're more like air conditioning systems in terms of that technology, the way they're made. And the government introduced an initial law that would force every homeowner to replace the heat pump starting in January next year. Now that it's only, there was I think a deadline for 2030 for existing homes. The next year was originally only for new homes. They've watered it down a little bit, but this is still a...
How much does it cost to do
depending
to
on
change
the
your house?
Depending on the house, between, in euros, which is almost the same as pounds, between 20 and 50,000 pounds.
And who's paying for that?
The owners pay for that. And
who has 20 to 50,000?
Yeah, especially East Germans, whose house values are hardly higher than 20 to 50,000. That's been a factor. Now, the government handled this terribly. And that was one, I mean, the rise in the AfD came sort of in waves. And this was the last wave. And the mishandling, that's where it came up from like 15 or 16% in support to about 20%.
Do you think it's fair to kind of summarize that as essentially left-leaning, idealistic, but impractical policies that have now kind of blown up, and people have seen the real-world results of them and they don't like them?
I would say this is not fundamentally an issue of the left versus the right. It is a fundamental issue of sort of three incompatible parties trying to reach a compromise that is a bad outcome and then managing it badly. A policy, of two other parties, any two of them could have probably managed this better. For example, had this been Britain or the US, they would not have given themselves the same fiscal constraints. A lot of bad policy decisions are taken because you impose yourself a financial constraint and then you do the cheapest thing, which is one of the reasons why Germany fell back technologically. I mean, this was a country that was, when I grew up, it was a high-tech country in those years. Today, it's a low-tech country. It's struggling with digital technologies. It's not investing into these modern industries, which is why its dependency on the old industries have become stronger. They are dependent on the old diesel cars.
What we think of as the kind of industrial center of Europe, which is Germany, and obviously within that the car industry is the biggest, is really vulnerable now because they're not so good at electric cars as they were at petrol cars, and it feels like China's overtaken them.
To put this mildly, I mean, they were shocked to see that China is now the largest. They came out of nowhere in the car industry. Within 3 years, China is now the largest exporter in world car exporter. And the German companies are struggling to sell their cars in China because that was a big surprise to them. They thought that because it was made in Germany, the Chinese actually like their own cars. And they are cheaper and they actually have features that the Germans cannot offer. And the reason for that is that China has a role in the electric car industry that Germany had in the old car industry. Germany owned the supply chain. So it's not just that the cars were made in Germany. That was almost the minor thing. The bigger issue was that Germany owned factories in the Czech Republic, in Spain, and all, many East European countries, Central East European countries, also abroad in Asia and in the United States. And it was basically a giant network of suppliers. They championed just-in-time production. So the Germans were and they owned the whole thing. Now China owns the supply chain of the electric car, the batteries, the rare earths, magnets, and all these sort of things that matter for lithium, the new gold. The Germans have basically said, oh my God, we have to get a battery production. And we need to get chips that produce our car industry. So they got Intel to build a factory for chips. But it's still geared towards cars, basically. This is not a country that, this is a country that had the facility and the ability to be a major player in the digital world and has kind of given up on this.
So where does the blame lie for this? I mean, we can talk about these things almost as if they're changes in the weather and they just happen. But
exactly.
Can we make the case that actually the whole sort of settlement that was there for those decades was inherently fragile, and that Germany, above all, maybe, was naive to think that it would just last forever.
That's right, and I think the root of it is what I call sort of a system of neo-mercantilism, reliance on industry for exports, and for a government to follow the wishes of the industry. I mean, one of the reasons is these. You remember the diesel scandal, where they introduced cheating devices. The reason this came up in the United States and not in the EU was that the EU was looking the other way, and the EU testing of cars was defunded basically, and compared to what's happening in the United States. So the German government helped companies, in this case indirectly, maybe unwittingly. I don't want to infer any sort of conspiracies here, but at least unwittingly helped companies either in this case commit crimes, but also helped companies adjusted its foreign policies according to corporate needs. The foreign policy of Germany was a business-driven foreign policy. It was not driven by geopolitical or other security interests. It was business-driven. And that's still, this has changed with this government. But
just to spell that out, the foreign policy was a kind of maximal globalized world with, that worked very well for its car industry because it had these incredible supply chains that could be relied on from the other side of the world. And so it wanted that to last as long as possible.
Germany's model depended on globalization, that type of globalization which we had, I put the period from 1990 to about 2020. That period, and it was already fading in the years running up to COVID. Germany was dependent on the Russian gas flowing forever, and on globalization lasting forever, and on the digital technologies not to be very important.
These populist backlashes, the rise of parties like the AfD, in some way are understandable, angry reactions to just decades of naivety and basically incompetence.
That's exactly what it is. That sort of doubling in the size of support is the result of a country's economic model basically running down the ground. If you work for an industrial company that supplies the car industries, you know that your job isn't going to be secure. There are a lot of fears about the future, and rightly so. If you're trained to be a mechanical technician, you are right to be worried, because the country may not be able to support enough jobs for this particular highly specialist segment. They're highly trained.
So we could see something equivalent to the closure of the coal mines in the 1980s here in England happening in Germany if those car factories cease to function.
Germany has many strengths, but it is not a very agile economy, in the sense that when sort of a shock like this happens, there is no tradition. It doesn't have an entrepreneurial spirit. So there is, on the one hand, a battle between the classic left and the classic right in politics. But the more interesting battle, I think, is between the old business and the new business community, and that's where they're going apart. And the political system tends to favor the old system, because both the left and the right parties tend to support old companies and act in the interest of old companies.
I guess the bigger question is, what on earth happens next? Because we've the whole world order that we've been used to for all these decades is built on countries like Germany fulfilling these roles.
The irony of the situation is the stronger the AfD gets, the harder it is for governments to solve it, because under systems of proportional representation, it is difficult for centrist parties to form coalitions, classic coalitions like one of the left or one of the right, if there are parties like the AfD who are sort of outside the political system. No one would ever go into a coalition with them. So there's the hard left. There's also the hard right. There's also the left party, and the left party might disappear. There's an awful lot of problems that party has, but there's a prospect of another left party coming, which is specifically focused on the Russia-Ukraine war. Sort of a party of the left that.
Anti-NATO,
anti-weapons deliveries for Ukraine, and there is a lot of support for that in Germany. So the country is really split on this. Split in
Do you have a sense of what proportion of the population has doubts about?
I think it's about half. There was a recent poll asking about weapons, the next stage of weapons deliveries of cruise missiles. and there was a majority against, a strong majority against. Now that's a specific question. The other polls that I've seen were kind of in the 50-50 era and weakening. A bit like in the United States. We saw it started with very strong support, and the support is still there, but it's weakening, and it's not like it's flipped completely. That's where I see it, but the longer this goes on, the harder it will become.
Can you not make a similar argument there, that they are seeing the impacts of that policy on energy prices, on dividing the world economy, on bringing on some kind of new Cold War situation with Russia and China, and they don't think it's worth it as voters, and they choose to oppose it?
No, absolutely. That's exactly the reason. I mean, they're making the connection between the support of Ukraine and the fact that, they know that Germany is dependent on China and dependent on Russia. And they see that this is a policy or a change in the world environment that is not in Germany's favor. So voters are not entirely stupid, when they vote for the AfD or when they vote for parties that are opposing this, because they may be dependent on that old structure, or they may have known nothing else. So there is a sense that this is now interrupted, and it is interrupted due to politics, and the government is doing something unreasonable by supporting Ukraine. So there is an electorate for that, and
there's a rationale there, whether you agree with it or not.
The AfD captures a lot of that, but there may be now a party on the left by a very sort of maverick, politician who is left or who is on the verge of leaving the left party, who may be forming a party of the left, and that party is also on opinion polls has a potential of 20% of the electorate.
What sort of populist, or whether a good version or a bad version, can you imagine what a program might be that might kind of excite people? Is it likely to be more protectionist? Is it likely to sound like, to paraphrase Donald Trump, it would be Germany first? It would shed some of these more idealistic ideas and be more pragmatic about energy, about war with Ukraine. It would, I don't know, be shoring up factories, or what is the most likely?
I think the least likely is the one that I would suggest, which is the
least likely.
The least likely,
right.
Which is the one that to say, look, I mean, we're going through a transition. It's going to be hard. We need to remedy the lack of investment into modern technologies. We should accept that the future doesn't lie in machine tools. So we open up the economy with a sort of we deregulate our bureaucracy and let companies be companies. And deregulate their taxes. We may not subsidize them, but we will certainly leave them to flourish. And the country has enough talent, so they should be able to figure this out. This is not going to happen.
That's I would say a traditional centre-right type response.
And very boring in many ways, what I'm suggesting. But I think that would work. But it's not going to happen. So if there was a Trump-like character, obviously not with the same kind of language, because the German. That probably wouldn't sit well with the German sort of mindset, but a Germany first approach to industrial policy, something like what Gerhard Schröder.
Make Germany great again.
That's ultimately what Gerhard Schröder was about. I mean, Gerhard Schröder I always thought of him as him and Berlusconi as the first great European, sort of first populists. They were centrist, and they were not there was nothing extreme about them in terms of their political views. They were just very much pro-business. And I think some characters like that could reemerge to say, this has been a mistake. This support for Ukraine, our support for the United States. So I think it would start off with becoming more US skeptic. I think the Germans were slightly blind. They hated Trump so much that anyone who came after him was good, and they didn't quite see how dangerous for them Biden would be. I mean, first of all, there is the anti-China policy that is really not in Germany's economic interest. Unless you want to change, if you're basically in sort of a no change mindset in Germany, you want to continue trading with China, and then the US position on China is not on your side. The US Inflation Reduction Act is a massive program on subsidies for companies to leave, places like Europe and to resettle in the United States. A program like this is causing enormous difficulties for the German companies, because a lot of companies are VW, Volkswagen is just, instead of investing a massive factory in Germany, which they had planned, they're now doing this in the United States, and there's an awful lot of stuff like that happening. What I would see could happen is that a character would come in opposition to the United States. And I think that would probably be the focus in saying, like, we are not a geopolitical nation. We are not good at this stuff. Let's trade. Let's do what we have always done, and let's be friends with our companies and let the needs of our industry dictate where we stand politically.
A pragmatic
view, and if the war ends, we'll be doing business with them. It's not our business who runs Russia. It's or who runs China. We're not here to. So that we are reverting to the old pragmatism. That I think is a possibility. Nobody has dared do that yet, because, as you know, in the beginning of the Ukraine war, there was such an emotional support for Ukraine that anyone who said this was immediately kind of,
you get called pro-Putin and so on.
You would be called names and be called pro-Putin, and
it's quite an interesting. I haven't heard that concept before. It's quite interesting. So that would have huge ramifications for the world. If a party became really popular, or even in the government in Germany, that was explicitly saying, let's just be pragmatic, let's make friends again with Russia, let's make friends again with China, let's try to worry about our economy and our energy prices and our industrial heartlands first, and leave international adventures to one side.
Exactly. And I think they would probably phrase it the way you do, not in the Trump language. It would be basically a pitch very close to what you just said. It would be basically what Merkel did. It's not fundamentally different. I mean, Merkel sort of dabbled in geopolitics, but ultimately that was the policy she deployed. I mean, her big shortcoming, that for which you will remember historically more than anything else, is the fact that this economic decline that we are seeing in Germany now had its root in policies that she undertook, but that didn't have immediate consequences. And we always talked about during the Eurozone crisis, we talked about kicking the can down the road and used sort of metaphors of that sort of nature. But that is exactly what happened. Everything they did, no problems were resolved. There was always a long timetable for everything.
What happens if that doesn't happen? If this current decline trajectory continues, which I guess is the most likely outcome, what do you think happens to Germany and to Europe without a strong Germany at its center?
I mean, people often make the mistake when they talk about Europe that they think it will blow up. I always get sort of questions from Eurosceptic British media saying, I mean, does this mean they will leave? Is there going to be another Brexit? The bigger danger to the EU is not that it blows up. It's not going to blow up. It's legally enshrined. Have you seen in the UK how difficult it is to leave? And if you have the euro as your currency, it would be 10 times as difficult to leave. I don't think any country can do this. The much bigger the danger for the EU is that it becomes toothless and ineffective. There was a whole period from like the mid-70s to the mid-80s where nothing happened in Brussels. It was a period of the EU being just where it is and just doing its own business, but it's not ultimately been doing much. And then there was a long period from 85 to not too long ago, where the EU expanded its remit into monetary union and other areas, interior and refugees and other foreign policy now. And what could happen is that, I mean, most of these recent expansion, the monetary union was for real, but much of what the EU did much of what the EU did in this century, doesn't have much solid ground.
So this potential vision, you don't like to make hard predictions, but you're talking about what likely outcomes are, is a little bit depressing. It feels like it's a Europe that is, we talk quite often about the West being in decline, but it sounds like Europe in particular is going to face a tough future.
I think that's right. Obviously, it's going to be a tough period. That's for sure. These periods ends. Countries have gone through periods of decline and then recovered. The UK was an example in the 70s and 80s. This is possible. I can't exclude, that we strike at lucky at some point again. But this is going to be a difficult period. And there's also what makes me particularly skeptical is that I don't see anyone who has an idea. A bright idea of how to solve the problem, even if that sort of person was only a fringe political figure, but that I don't even see that happening. So most of the political debate is between people who want to subsidize industry and then who want to subsidize green technologies, but there's never a somebody who tries to arrest the decline and tries to see how this sort of economic model, or how one can change and innovate this economic model, reform this economic model. It's all the same again and again, and it's not there isn't a left versus right axis on which, if only this party won the next election, things would get better. That is not the case. But I think that there is a pattern. And the pattern is that there is a decline in the West, in the Western dominance of the world. We see this in in the fact that our sanctions on Russia are not really sticking as much as we hoped they would. They have an effect, but they're not what we thought they would do. And that's to do with the fact that the West, we are no longer calling the shots. There's the BRICS, there's China, there are many countries that are not on our sides in this world. And the decline of the West, and America is still strong in terms of its technological leadership, but I see a decline, also a lack of willingness for the US to take the role that it used to take. And the EU being sort of very dependent on the US for its protection, but also dependent on globalization for its economic success, is in an impossible position. And that it hasn't really even started to discuss what it needs to do to survive in this sort of new world.
Hearing you talk about the likely trajectory of Europe, it puts the Brexit question into a slightly different colour. All we ever read in the newspapers is the disaster of Brexit and the economic cost and the paperwork and everything else. But big picture, is there almost an argument to say we've had our fight, we've had our pain early, and at least in the UK, we are at liberty to make such a new radical economic pivot if we want. So maybe we're better off out after all.
Except that you don't. There would have been one valid and good Brexit argument that I would have accepted. And this is the one which you precisely alluded to. We do Brexit because we can improve on the economic model. We can do this differently. That's not happening. I think this is the great tragedy of Brexit, that the UK had this opportunity to shift its economic model was shaped by the government of the 1980s. It's, with development zones, it's very much geared towards the single European market. That was a big, you probably remember Heseltine and all this, the Thatcher government trying to really position the UK as the prime location for international investors who are entering the European single market. The Blair administration continued this sort of process of European business integration, and this was sort of the business model. The city was the Eurozone's banker. The UK didn't want to join the Eurozone, but it wanted to be the banker of another currency zone, which is another question of, this is clearly not a sustainable model either. So on Brexit, you would have thought you need to change that kind of model, that dependency on Europe for trade, dependency on Europe for, to act as its financial center. And, one could have conceivably thought of a sort of a new age, digital model, but the UK still has the same old rules. We're still it still has the same rules on data protection laws, for example, and many, many others. So the UK is, and that's to do with the fact that British governments did not kind of focus on this. Given that, the UK has a strong foundation in science and technology, just as Germany does, they also do. And one could have used these strengths to forge a new business model around these ideas, so and that didn't happen. And therefore, therefore the discussion is different. That's why we're reading these stories of Brexit being a disaster, because it's when I remember writing, you referred to my columns that I wrote for many years at the beginning of the show. I used to write that the economic of Brexit cannot be ascertained, that it would depend very much on what people make of it. And it is possible that it is positive. If you only look at trade, you can always count the cost of trade friction and the trade that you're not doing, but you can never count the cost of the opportunities that you actually nurture as a result of having a different regulatory regime or having, a different...
Is it too late, though?
It's not too late. It can be done. But it would require, again, as I say, I don't see anyone in German politics who actually focuses on the economic model, but I don't see this in the UK politics either. There's a prime minister who thinks he can reduce inflation, or the opposition who basically wants to do the same thing what the government is doing, only with different, with
different
some
terms and different labels,
with some differences, but nothing that pertains to this debate. whatever the differences are, it is not essentially about the economic model.
If you were a betting man, which of Germany and the UK do you think will be in a relatively stronger position in 10 years' time?
I would say the UK.
That's a good note to end on. Thanks for coming to talk to us, Wolfgang.
Yes.
That was Wolfgang Munchau, economist, realistic observer of Germany and Europe. His message might have seemed somewhat technical and detailed, but the big picture that emerges from it is clear and pretty sobering. Germany is in trouble. The big structural factors that supported its economy for decades have changed, have disappeared. With decline in Germany will come decline in Europe, and without a new vision, a new energy, most likely will come sclerosis or paralysis. And that is going to affect us all and may well mean difficult, possibly acrimonious politics for years to come. There was a little note of optimism at the end there, that there is still at least a theoretical chance that the UK at least could make use of its independence to forge a different path. But as Wolfgang said, there isn't many leaders about who seem to have such a vision. I found it absolutely fascinating. I hope you did too. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd.